Imagine a world where ancient wisdom, wisdom long lost for centuries, suddenly just reappears.
Yeah.
And it challenges everything people thought they knew.
Right.
Picture these medieval universities, just vibrant with intellectual debate, alive with the clash of ideas and the fervor of really profound questioning.
A real melting pot of thought.
Exactly. And this question arises, could human reason, purely on its own, without direct divine revelation, could it actually point us toward God?
It's a huge question.
And one towering intellect of the Middle Ages, often revered as the Angelic Doctor, he argued with powerful conviction that, yes, it absolutely could.
That's right. And today, we're taking that deep dive into the extraordinary life and truly revolutionary thought of St. Thomas Aquinas.
For this deep dive, we're going to explore the unique intellectual landscape that shaped him, the seismic shift he brought about by integrating classical philosophy with Christian theology.
Which was huge.
Huge. And how his logical arguments for God's existence still resonate, still get debated today.
They really do. We'll unpack his famous 5 ways for demonstrating God's existence, examine his profound understanding of God's nature, often described, interestingly, through what he isn't rather than what he is.
The via negativa, right?
Exactly. And ultimately, look at his enduring legacy on Western thought and Christian theology, which is just, well, immense.
So let's set the scene. Let's unpack this medieval world Thomas Aquinas found himself navigating. What was going on?
Okay, so it's crucial to understand the context of the 13th century. After the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of Aristotle's monumental body of work, this vast collection covering logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, natural science, it was unfortunately mostly lost to the Western world.
Right, this great gap people talk about.
Exactly. It's often called the Great Gap in terms of intellectual access to these classical texts. It wasn't that the West completely forgot Greek philosophy, but a huge chunk of Aristotle's his precise, systematic, very empirical approach was simply unavailable in Latin for centuries.
So Western Europe was basically working with an incomplete library of classical thought. But these works weren't just gone forever, were they? Who kept that flame alive? And how did it get back to Europe?
Well, that's where the brilliance of Islamic and Jewish scholars comes right into the picture. They meticulously preserved, studied, translated, and importantly, built upon these works. They were absolutely vital intellectual conduits.
Like who, specifically?
Well, figures like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, a true polymath of Islam's classical period, and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, they were central. Ibn Sina, for instance, didn't just translate Aristotle's metaphysics. He created his own massive encyclopedic works like the Canon of Medicine, which incredibly became a standard medical text in Europe for hundreds of years. And his philosophical work profoundly influenced thought. Averroes from Al-Andalus was famously known as the commentator because he wrote these extensive, incredibly influential commentaries on Aristotle. These scholars didn't just preserve, they deeply engaged with, clarified, and often expanded upon Aristotle's complex ideas, adding their own significant contributions.
So they weren't just translating, they were actively thinking with Aristotle.
Precisely. So when these texts finally made their way back into Europe, often through places like Spain or Sicily, they just sparked this profound, really transformative, renewed interest in classical philosophy. It was like, as you said, suddenly rediscovering an entire intellectual continent.
I can only imagine the intellectual shockwave. Suddenly, centuries of intellectual development from another culture, built on the very foundations of Greek thought, crashes into the existing European scholastic traditions. But this wasn't universally welcomed, was it? Especially with Christian theologians, there must have been serious apprehension.
Oh, absolutely. Deep suspicion from many corners. You have to remember, the prevailing Christian worldview had largely relied on Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophical frameworks. These were seen as, well, more naturally compatible with Christian doctrines like the immortality of the soul, creation, that sort of thing.
Right, they seem to fit better.
Exactly. Aristotle's emphasis on empirical observation, his arguments about the eternity of the world, which was a major point of contention, and just his whole philosophical method seemed to pose a direct challenge. There were real concerns that these new ideas, even though ancient, could fundamentally threaten established Christian doctrine.
worries about paganism creeping back in.
Yes, potentially leading to a revival of paganism given their non-Christian origins, and perhaps even undermining the absolute authority of Scripture, which was, the ultimate source of truth for them.
And this wasn't just some abstract academic squabble. It really heated up during the Cathar crisis in the 12th century. That was a very real perceived threat, wasn't it?
Yeah.
How did that connect to the fears about Aristotle?
Right, the Cathars. They were deemed heretical by the church, and they preached this radical dualistic theology. They believed in two gods, a good God who created the spiritual world, and an evil God, often identified with the Old Testament God, who created the material world.
So matter itself was evil in their view.
Essentially, yes. Humanity, for them, was caught in this struggle with souls trapped in corrupt physical bodies. Now, surprisingly, this dualistic view resonated in some ways with certain aspects of previously suppressed philosophical ideas, particularly those that drew a sharp line between spirit and matter, or maybe saw matter as inherently flawed or evil.
So the reappearance of these ancient texts seemed to provide intellectual fuel for these heresies in the eyes of the church.
Exactly. It made the reemerging pagan philosophical texts seem even more suspicious, even dangerous, because they looked like they could offer intellectual ammunition for ideas the church considered profoundly wrong.
Okay, so the church is in a tough spot. These powerful philosophical tools are back, but they seem potentially dangerous. This leads to a fascinating turn, sort of an intellectual judo move, as you put it.
Yeah.
The Dominican order, which Aquinas would later join, was founded largely to combat Catharism. How did they tackle this?
Well, they realized pretty quickly that simply dismissing these new ideas wasn't going to cut it. To effectively counter these challenges, which were deeply philosophical and theological, they needed to understand them, engage with them directly, and ultimately demonstrate their compatibility with Orthodox Christian beliefs or show where they went wrong.
So you have to know your enemy, so to speak.
In a way, yes. It meant becoming incredibly well-versed in the very Aristotelian thought that was causing all the fuss. And this led to this really interesting twist where, out of necessity and driven by intellectual rigor, Dominicans like Albert the Great, who became Aquinas' teacher and later Aquinas himself, actually became proponents of Aristotle's philosophy.
While staying Orthodox Christians.
Absolutely. While maintaining Orthodox Christian beliefs, it was a kind of strategic intellectual embrace using the tools, the logic, the framework of Aristotle to defend and clarify the Christian faith. A remarkable strategy, really.
I can see how that would demand a truly systematic, disciplined approach. Now, Aristotle wasn't entirely unknown before this, right? He was part of the standard education, the trivium.
That's true. He was already a cornerstone in the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. His logical works were fundamental. But the 12th century Renaissance brought the full scope of his philosophical works, metaphysics, ethics, physics, things previously unknown or inaccessible into Latin translation. And this broader intellectual movement, heavily inspired by Aristotle and really dominating university thought, became known as scholasticism.
And what defined scholasticism? What was its core method?
Well, scholasticism was this incredibly rigorous, systematic approach to knowledge. It was characterized by dialectical reasoning, presenting arguments and counter-arguments, objections and replies, plus logical analysis, and this painstaking effort to reconcile different authorities, especially faith and reason. The goal was to create a unified system of knowledge.
A grand synthesis.
Precisely. And Aquinas' own education was the perfect environment for this. At the Studium Generale in Naples, which Emperor Frederick II had established, he was explicitly introduced not just to the full range of Aristotle, but also to the works of the great commentators like Averroes and Jewish thinkers like Maimonides.
So he got the whole package early on.
He really did. His teacher there, Petrus de Ibernia, was a direct conduit for these re-emerging ideas. It absolutely set the stage for Aquinas' unique synthesis. It was in this intellectually charged atmosphere that he began building his framework.
So, this ferment sets the perfect stage for Thomas Aquinas, the ultimate bridge builder between faith and reason. Let's talk about the man himself. His early life, his rather unusual calling, born into aristocracy, but he didn't exactly follow that path, did he?
No, not at all. Born in Roccasecca, near Aquino, into a noble family with connections to the Holy Roman Emperor, no less, Thomas was absolutely expected to pursue a prestigious career. Maybe become an abbot of a wealthy monastery like Monte Cassino, where he first studied, or even a powerful political figure.
The family had plans.
Big plans. But he chose a completely different path. He decided to join the Dominicans. This was a relatively new order, remember, focused on preaching and teaching, founded by St. Dominic just a few decades earlier. They were known for their intellectual rigor and their commitment to engaging with the public, not just staying in monasteries.
A radical choice for someone of his background.
Absolutely. It was deeply influenced by figures like John of St. Julian, apparently, and it utterly changed the course of his life, and you could argue the whole history of Western thought. His family was reportedly so against it, they even kidnapped him at one point to try and dissuade him.
Seriously? They kidnapped him?
That's the story. Held him captive in the family castle for about a year, trying to break his resolve, but he stood firm, shows his determination even then.
That's incredible. And there's that famous anecdote about his early days as a Dominican, the Dummox nickname. What's the story there?
Yes, the Dummox. It's a wonderful story, really tells you something. When he first joined the order and started his studies, probably in Paris or Cologne under Albert the Great, Thomas was apparently very quiet, quite large physically, and just seemed absorbed in deep thought. He often appeared slow or unresponsive to his classmates.
So they thought he was slow.
They misunderstood his profound interiority, yeah. So they nicknamed him the Dummox. But his teacher, Albert the Great himself, a towering intellect known as Albertus Magnus, he famously saw right through that quiet exterior.
What did he say?
He declared, "You call him the dumb ox, but I tell you, the bellowing of this ox will one day resound throughout the world." Albert recognized the immense intellectual power just brewing inside his student, and, well, he couldn't have been more right. Absolutely prophetic.
G.K. Chesterton wrote a famous profile of Aquinas, and he captures this essence brilliantly. Chesterton observed that while someone like St. Francis of Assisi is marked by, a shower of personal anecdotes and popular legends.
Very accessible, very human stories.
Right. St. Thomas was more like a labyrinthine city, which suggests this mind that was just profound, systematic, intellectually immense, rather than, say, public or flamboyant. He seemed driven by this internal intellectual intensity.
That's a brilliant metaphor. Aquinas wasn't about public display. His life was primarily lived in his mind, in his study, in his teaching. He lived and breathed ideas. It was all about the argument, the structure, the system.
And there's that amazing anecdote that perfectly illustrates this intense focus. Supposedly, Aquinas was once dining at the court of King Louis IX of France, a very public, very formal setting.
Right, St. Louis, a very pious king himself.
And Aquinas was apparently so completely lost in thought, refuting Manichaean ideas, those dualistic beliefs we mentioned earlier.
The ones that the Dominicans were founded to combat.
Exactly. He was so engrossed that he suddenly slammed his fist on the table and blurted out, "And that is the decisive argument against the Manichees," or something to that effect.
You can just picture the scene. Dead silence, everyone staring.
Yeah, imagine the court, the king, everyone startled by this outburst from the usually quiet friar. People probably looked nervously at King Louis, expecting him to be annoyed.
But King Louis wasn't annoyed, was he?
Not at all. Recognizing Aquinas' brilliance and his deep focus, the story goes that King Louis instead turned to his secretaries and told them to quickly grab their tablets and write down the argument. Because, as he supposedly said, it must be a very good one and he might forget it.
That's fantastic. It really highlights Aquinas' singular intellectual intensity. He wasn't performing, he was just thinking at this incredibly high level, completely absorbed.
This intellectual power fueled a truly staggering amount of writing, didn't it?
Oh, unbelievably prolific. His monumental works include the Summa Theology, this vast, systematic summary of Christian theology, structured with questions, articles, objections, and replies. It was intended as a comprehensive guide for theology students.
The ultimate textbook, almost.
In a way, but so much more. And then there's the Summa Contra Gentiles, which was specifically aimed at addressing philosophical and theological objections to Christian faith, often engaging directly with the arguments of Islamic and Jewish philosophers he encountered through those translations.
So one for teaching Christians, one more for engaging with non-Christian philosophy.
Broadly speaking, yes. And beyond these massive summae, he wrote extensive, detailed commentaries on Aristotle, on his metaphysics, ethics, physics, logic, really cementing his role as that bridge between the Aristotelian world and the Christian world, carefully explaining and integrating Aristotle's thought.
Okay, so let's get to the core of this bridge building. Aquinas proposed what he called a twofold mode of truth concerning what we profess about God. What did he mean by that? Two kinds of truth about God.
Essentially, yes. He distinguished between truths about God that are discoverable through rigorous, rational demonstration, things reason can figure out on its own, and then truths that are known primarily through faith, through divine revelation.
And this wasn't just some abstract distinction for him, was it? It was foundation.
Absolutely foundational. For Aquinas, reason wasn't the enemy of faith. It was a tool, a capacity given by God. He believed reason could demonstrably prove certain fundamental aspects of divine reality. These rational efforts, if done correctly, could yield conclusions that were necessary and certain.
Like what, for example? What could reason prove on its own?
Well, this is what he called natural theology. Through reason alone observing the world, he argued you could establish God's existence, we'll get to the 5 ways later, and you could also deduce certain essential attributes like God's oneness, his immateriality, his eternality, his omnipotence. These are truths, in his view, accessible simply by applying sound logic to our experience of reality.
So reason can lay a foundation.
Exactly. He wasn't claiming we could figure out everything about God through reason, like the Trinity or the Incarnation. Those require revelation. But he strongly believed that human reasoning could illuminate significant aspects of Christian faith. He called these rationally demonstrable truths preambles to the articles of faith.
Preambles, like an introduction.
Kind of. They're truths that reason can grasp, which support and lead into the truths accepted by faith. It also meant that faith wasn't completely irrational. It had a rational foundation you could point to. And crucially, for those who maybe couldn't follow the complex philosophical arguments, they could still accept these truths on faith, showing reason and faith working together.
Okay, so reason gets us part of the way, providing this logical groundwork. But faith takes us further, into the mysteries revealed by God. How did he see the actual assent of faith itself? How is it different from just agreeing with a logical proof?
That's a crucial distinction he makes. For Aquinas, the assent of faith is fundamentally voluntary. It's not just the intellect recognizing a truth. It involves the will as well.
The will. How does that play into belief?
When he talks about the will, he means our native desire, our inclination or love for what we perceive as good, what contributes to our happiness and ultimate fulfillment. Here's how it connects. You might be intellectually persuaded by an argument, say, from one of the 5 ways, or maybe by hearing a sermon, that ultimate human happiness lies in knowing and loving God.
Okay, the intellect agrees.
Right. But for Aquinas, merely acknowledging that truth intellectually, or even feeling compelled to accept it because the argument seems strong, isn't enough to constitute what he calls commendable faith. It's not salvific faith yet.
Why not? If you're convinced, aren't you?
Yeah. He uses the example of demons. He says demons believe many truths about God. They know God exists, they know Christ is Lord, but they are compelled to believe. The evidence is just overwhelming for them, perhaps through direct experience. Their belief isn't shaped by any love or affection for God. They don't desire God as their good, so their belief isn't praiseworthy. It doesn't save them.
So it's not just a cognitive tick box, yes, I accept this proposition. It's got to involve the heart, the desires. It's effective.
Precisely. It's profoundly effective. A person might be intellectually convinced of certain sacred truths, but still choose not to truly endorse them, not to orient their life towards them. Or, alternatively, driven by a love for God or a deep desire for ultimate goodness and happiness, they might actively seek God as their proper end, their ultimate good.
That sounds like the key difference.
It is. This love for God, this affection for the divine as the ultimate good, the source of all happiness, is what shapes genuine faith. It distinguishes it from mere intellectual assent or even grudging acknowledgement. He calls it the appetitive aspect, the desiring, willing part of us. The will, moved by this love or desire for goodness, actively moves us towards God as our ultimate happiness. This brings the whole person, mind and heart, intellect and will, into the act of belief.
That's a much richer picture of faith.
Yeah.
So mind and heart together. This leads us to his really revolutionary insight, the complementary relationship of faith and reason. He saw no inherent conflict, which must have been a pretty bold stance back then.
Absolutely bold and incredibly important. For Aquinas, faith actually presupposes natural cognition. It doesn't destroy reason, it builds upon it. He used that famous analogy. Grace presupposes nature, and perfection presupposes the perfectible. Meaning, just as God's grace works with and elevates our natural human abilities, faith builds upon and perfects our natural capacity to reason. He was convinced that what he called veritable reason, true, sound reasoning, and faith could never truly contradict each other because they both ultimately originate from the same divine source, from God who is truth itself.
So if there seems to be a conflict, either the reasoning is flawed Or the understanding of faith is mistaken.
That was his position. Reason for him could even deduce the existence of God that was part of natural theology, or metaphysics, as Aristotle called it. This integration was revolutionary because it established this robust philosophical framework where reason could actively explore, understand, and even support theological truths without undermining the unique and essential role of divine revelation.
It meant you didn't have to choose between being intelligent and being faithful.
Exactly. You didn't have to check your intellect at the door to enter the church. In fact, your intellect, properly used, could lead you closer to understanding divine truths. It gave intellectual credibility and a systematic structure to theology that was incredibly powerful.
And he extended this integrated vision to really profound questions, like sin and atonement, central Christian doctrines. How did he address humanity's need for redemption within this faith and reason framework?
He addressed sin and human renovation with great theological and philosophical depth. He believed that the remission of sin forgiveness and the moral transformation of humanity are accomplished through God's work in Christ. Specifically, he focused intensely on Christ's passion, his suffering, and his death on the cross.
The core of the Christian story.
Right. He argued that Christ's loving obedience to the Father, his willingness to suffer unjustly for the sake of justice itself, merited God's favor in an extraordinary way. This merit was so immense, so profound, that it was sufficient to atone for everyone's sin. But it's crucial how he understood atonement.
It wasn't just about paying a debt or appeasing an angry God.
No, not primarily like that. He moved away from some earlier models that emphasized appeasement or strict legal satisfaction. While he used the term satisfaction, its purpose, for Aquinas, was primarily to renovate human wills.
Renovate human wills. What does that mean?
Sin, for Aquinas, fundamentally twists our inclinations. It turns us away from God, our true good, and towards lesser, created goods in a disordered way. This creates vicious habits, vices, that alienate us from God. Christ's perfect act of loving obedience and sacrificial suffering serves as both the ultimate example and a source of transformative grace.
So it changes us from the inside out.
That's the idea. It aims to transform these vicious inclinations, heal our wounded nature, and make possible a right relationship with God again. It's meant to produce a genuine love for God within us, restoring the friendship broken by sin. So we shouldn't view Christ's sacrifice simply as, say, a legal instrument for wiping sins off a ledger.
But as something that actively changes us?
Yes, as an act whose sacrificial efforts actively produce this renewed union and love within us, reorienting our wills back towards goodness and our ultimate happiness, which is found only in God. It's a fundamental reordering of our being, moving us from self-centeredness to God-centeredness, made possible by Christ's act.
That's a powerful, deeply integrated vision. Human nature, sin, grace, Christ's work, all connected. Now let's get to what many people know Aquinas for. His arguments for God's existence, the famous 5 ways. What was his goal with these? Because they're often misunderstood, aren't they?
They really are. That's a critical starting point. The Quinque Viae, the 5 ways found in the Summa Theologica, are often presented or misinterpreted as attempts to logically force an atheist into belief, like a mathematical proof that leaves no room for doubt.
That wasn't his main goal.
Not really his primary aim. Their purpose is more to demonstrate that God's existence is demonstrable, that it can be known through observing the effects in the natural world that we see all around us. They sealed as those preambles to the articles of faith we talked about.
Showing reason can get you there.
Exactly. Showing that reason, operating independently on observed reality, can point towards the existence of a God. It provides a rational foundation for belief for those who are seeking it, or for those who perhaps don't fully grasp the demonstration itself but can accept its conclusion on faith, knowing it is rationally defensible.
So it's building a logical bridge from the world we see to the necessity of God. Less about converting hardened skeptics, more about providing rational grounds.
Precisely. And another key point. His approach is fundamentally metaphysical. He's focusing on an unchanging cause or mover that is sustaining motion and existence right now in the present moment.
Not just about the beginning of the universe.
Not primarily. That's a common misconception. He wasn't mainly offering a cosmological argument about the universe's origin point, though his arguments have implications for that. He was more concerned with what explains the universe's continuing existence and operation here and now. The basic premise running through the ways is that if there were no ultimate foundational reality sustaining things, no unmoved mover, no first cause, then everything we observe would eventually grind to a halt or cease to exist.
And since things clearly do exist and move.
then that ultimate reality must exist. That's the core logic. It's an argument from dependency. The dependent reality we see points to an independent, necessary reality.
Okay, let's dive into them. Maybe start with the second way, the argument from efficient causality. It feels quite direct. How does he build that one?
The second way starts with a really simple, direct observation. We find that among sensible things, there is an ordering of efficient causes. Basically, things cause other things.
Like dominoes falling or a parent having a child.
Exactly. Think about a sculptor carving a statue. The sculptor is the efficient cause of the statue. The statue might then cause an impression on someone looking at it, but the sculptor himself had a cause. His parents brought him into being, his teacher taught him skills, the quarry provided the marble, and so on. Everything we see seems to be an effect of some prior efficient cause.
Okay, seems straightforward. Causes and effects are everywhere.
Then comes the crucial premise. No thing can be an efficient cause of itself.
Why?
Why? Because for something to cause itself, it would have to exist before it existed in order to bring itself into being.
Which is impossible. You can't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps into existence.
Precisely. A statue can't sculpt itself. You can't be your own parent. It's a logical contradiction.
Makes perfect sense. So if everything has a cause and nothing can cause itself, what's the next step?
The next step is the linchpin. He argues that it is impossible to go on to infinity among efficient causes. You can't have an infinite regress, an endless chain of causes stretching back forever without a beginning, at least not in a chain where each cause is essential for the next one to act now.
Why not? Why can't the chain just go back infinitely?
Think about it this way. In a chain of dependent causes where the second cause only acts because the first one does, and the third only because the second does, if there is no first cause, then there can be no second or third cause, and ultimately no final effect. If the first domino never falls, the last one certainly won't.
So if the chain of causes responsible for something existing right now went back infinitely with no ultimate starting point for that causal activity,
then nothing should be happening now. There would be no intermediate causes acting and no final effect being produced. But we clearly do observe effects existing in the world. The world exists, you exist, processes are happening. Since effects demonstrably exist, there must be a first efficient cause that initiates and sustains the entire chain of causation happening now.
a cause that isn't itself caused by anything prior.
Exactly, an uncaused cause. Therefore, he concludes, one must posit some first efficient cause, which everyone calls a god. Again, the emphasis isn't necessarily on a temporal beginning, but on the ultimate sustaining cause of all present existence and causality.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And the first way, the argument from motion, it has a very similar logical structure, doesn't it? Also feels quite intuitive.
It does, very similar logic. The core idea starts with another obvious observation. We see motion or change everywhere in the world. And by motion, Aquinas means any kind of change, not just moving from place to place, but also growth, decay, heating up, cooling down, any alteration.
Change is constant.
Right, and his premise is, whatever is in motion or undergoing change is moved or changed by something else. Nothing moves itself from a state of potentiality to actuality without an external agent. Think of a cold cup of coffee. It has the potential to be hot, but it won't get hot unless something else, like a microwave or hot water, actualizes that potential.
Something have to act on it.
Exactly. A ball rolling was pushed or thrown. A tree growing is drawing nutrients, moved by sun, water, soil. You can always trace the change back to a prior mover or changer. Now, just like with causes, Aquinas argues that you cannot have an infinite regress of movers.
Why not? Same reason as before.
Similar reason. If you had an infinite chain of things moving other things, with no first mover to initiate the sequence, then no motion could ever begin. If everything only moves because something else moved it, and that chain goes back forever, where did the initial push come from? Without a first mover, there'd be no subsequent motion.
Like an infinitely long train where no engine ever starts.
Perfect analogy. If motion were eternal and there were no unmoved mover, something that causes motion without itself being moved, then theoretically everything should have already reached a state of equilibrium, a state of rest, but clearly things are still moving and changing.
So because we see ongoing change,
There must be a first mover or an unmoved mover, something that imparts motion or causes change without itself being put into motion or changed by anything prior. This first mover isn't necessarily temporal, starting things off once upon a time, but is the fundamental, continually acting source of all the motion and change we observe happening right now. It's what keeps the universe dynamic. And this, Aquinas says, is what people understand to be God.
okay, so first mover, first cause. What about the third way, the argument from contingency? That sounds a bit more abstract.
It is a bit more abstract, but incredibly powerful. The third way focuses on the difference between things that could not exist, contingent beings, and something that must exist, a necessary being.
Contingent means it doesn't have to be here.
Exactly. Aquinas observes that everything in the natural world is contingent. It's possible for it to exist, but it's also possible for it not to exist. Everything we see comes into being and eventually passes out of being. Think of a tree, a star, you, me. We exist, but we weren't always here, and we won't be here forever in our current form. Our existence is dependent, fragile.
So, everything we encounter seems dependent on something else for its existence, and could, theoretically, not exist at all.
Right. Now, Aquinas argues, if everything were contingent, if every single thing had the possibility of not existing, then logically, given infinite time, which many philosophers, including Aristotle, assumed, there must have been a point when nothing existed. Because if everything can fail to exist, eventually it will.
If everything is possible to disappear, eventually everything would disappear.
That's the idea. If non-existence is a possibility for every single thing, then at some point that possibility would be realized for everything simultaneously. But, and here's the crucial step, if there ever was a time when absolutely nothing existed, then nothing could ever have come into existence.
Why not?
Because ex nihilo nihil fit from nothing, nothing comes. If there is truly nothing, there would be no potential, no cause, no way for anything to begin existing. But clearly, things do exist now. The universe is here, we are here.
So the fact that something exists now proves there couldn't have been a time when absolutely nothing existed.
Precisely. Therefore, Aquinas concludes, there must be something whose existence is not contingent, but necessary. Something that cannot not exist. This necessary being doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. Its nature is to exist. This necessary being is the ultimate ground for all the contingent things that do exist. And this all men speak of as God. This argument suggests that even if the universe itself were eternal, it would still require a necessary being to sustain its contingent existence moment by moment.
Wow. That one really makes you think about the very foundation of reality. Okay, fourth way, the argument from degrees of perfection or gradation. This seems different again, focusing on qualities like goodness and truth.
It does, yes. The fourth way starts by observing that we constantly make judgments about degrees of perfection in the world. We talk about things being more good, more true, more noble, more beautiful than other things.
Like helping someone is good, but sacrificing for them is more good. Or a theory can be true, but another can be more true, closer to reality.
Exactly. We recognize these gradations. A warm campfire is good, but a loving, supportive family is arguably more good. A simple sketch might be nice, but a masterpiece painting is more beautiful. Aquinas argues that these terms more and less only make sense if there's some ultimate standard, some maximum, against which we're implicitly measuring them.
How so?
Think about heat. We say something is hotter than something else. This implies the existence of something that is hottest, the maximum or absolute standard of heat, even if we haven't directly experienced it. Similarly, saying something is more good implies the existence of something that is supremely good, the standard of goodness itself.
So the very fact that we can recognize these degrees of perfection points toward a perfect source.
That's his argument. Whatever is the maximum in any category or genus is considered the cause of all the things in that category. For example, fire, considered the maximum of heat in his time, was thought to be the cause of all hot things. Therefore, Aquinas reasons, there must be something that is the ultimate cause of all being, goodness, truth, nobility, and every other perfection we observe in varying degrees in created things.
And that ultimate source must possess these qualities to the absolute maximum degree.
Precisely. This ultimate source of all perfection, which is perfect being, perfect goodness, perfect truth, we call God. God is the ultimate exemplar and the origin of all the limited perfections we see reflected dimly in the created world.
Right, that makes sense. Now the fifth way, the teleological argument or the argument from design. This one often feels the most intuitive or accessible to many people today. What's the core idea?
The fifth way looks at the orderliness and apparent purposefulness in the universe. Aquinas observes that things in the world, even things that lack intelligence themselves, like planets orbiting, seeds growing into specific kinds of plants, animals acting instinctively for survival or reproduction, seem to act towards an end, towards a specific goal or purpose.
They don't just behave randomly. There's a pattern, a direction.
Exactly. They act with regularity, achieving results that are beneficial or ordered as if they were directed. A tree consistently grows towards sunlight to photosynthesize. A bird instinctively builds a nest suitable for raising young. Aquinas argues, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with intelligence.
Like an arrow.
That's his analogy. An arrow doesn't fly towards a target on its own. It needs an archer to aim and shoot it. Similarly, he argues, these non-intelligent natural bodies and processes that consistently exhibit order and achieve specific ends must be directed or guided by an intelligent being who designed that order and purpose into them.
So the order points to an orderer.
Right. And this intelligent being, who directs all natural things to their end, he says, is God. This isn't a brand new idea with Aquinas, of course. It has very ancient roots. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle all spoke in different ways about a cosmic intelligence or reason, a nous or logos that guides or orders the universe.
So this idea that the universe shows signs of design, rather than just randomness, has been around a long, long time.
A very long time. Much later, David Hume's character Cleanthes famously articulated a version of it, likening the universe to a great machine where the intricate parts are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration. And from this, Cleanthes concluded that the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man, just vastly more powerful.
And then William Paley's watch analogy made it really famous, right?
Incredibly famous and accessible, Paley argued. If you found a watch lying on the ground, its intricate design and purposeful function would immediately lead you to conclude it had a maker, a watchmaker. You wouldn't assume it just assembled itself by chance. Similarly, he argued, the far greater complexity and purposeful design found in biological organisms like the human eye points even more strongly to a divine designer, God.
And this line of reasoning is still very much alive today, especially with the fine-tuning argument in cosmology. That seems like a modern echo of the fifth way.
It absolutely is. The fine-tuning argument points to the seemingly unbelievable precision of the fundamental physical constants of nature and the initial conditions of the universe. Things like the strength of gravity, the electromagnetic force, the expansion rate of the Big Bang.
If they were even slightly different.
Even infinitesimally different, life as we know it couldn't possibly exist. For example, proponents point out, if the Big Bang's expansion rate 1 second after the beginning had been smaller by just one part in 100,000 million, an incredibly tiny fraction, the universe would have collapsed back on itself almost immediately.
Wow.
Or if the strong nuclear force, which holds atomic nuclei together, were just 5% weaker or stronger, stars couldn't form the necessary elements for life. The intuition for many people is that this astonishing razor's edge precision looks less like random chance and more like deliberate design. The universe seems fine-tuned for life.
It implies a fine-tuner.
That's the inference many draw. It feels like the parameters were set just right.
But of course, this argument has its critics. Figures like Richard Dawkins have strong counter-arguments.
Indeed. Dawkins, among others, argues that invoking intelligent design simply begs the question. If the universe needs a complex designer, God, then who designed the even more complex designer? It seems to just push the problem back a step.
But who designed the designer?
Yeah, exactly. He also argues forcefully that natural selection provides a powerful, non-random explanation for the appearance of design in biology, working incrementally over vast stretches of time. It's a natural process that produces complexity without needing foresight or planning. And regarding fine-tuning, critics often invoke the anthropic principle.
Which says?
In its weak form, it basically says, of course we observed the universe to have properties that allow life to develop, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to observe it. It suggests our observation itself selects for a life-permitting universe from potentially many other possibilities, if a multiverse exists, or that it's simply a brute fact about the one universe we have.
So the debate goes on. It's fascinating how these arguments rooted in Aquinas are still central to discussions today, even online.
Absolutely. These debates are very lively, constantly being refined and argued on places like Reddit's philosophy forums, in academic journals, everywhere. It really shows the enduring power and relevance of Aquinas' initial formulations about reason pointing towards God.
Okay, so after laying out these arguments for God's existence, Aquinas then moves on to understanding God's nature. And he takes a rather unique approach here, doesn't he? Not so much saying what God is directly, but focusing on what God isn't, the via negativa.
That's exactly right. It's a cornerstone of his thought about God's nature. Aquinas was very aware that our human minds, because they derive all knowledge from experience of the finite created world, simply cannot have a direct, positive, and complete grasp of God's infinite essence in this life. We know God through his effects, the created world, the 5 ways, but those effects don't give us a full picture of the cause.
Our concepts are based on created things, which are limited. God is unlimited, so our concepts fall short.
Precisely. Therefore, the best way to approach understanding God, especially initially, is negatively. It's called the via negativa, the way of negation, or sometimes the via remotionis, the way of removal. You systematically deny of God any imperfections or limitations found in created things.
So you sort of carve away everything God isn't to get a clearer, though still incomplete, sense of what he must be. It sounds like a profound act of intellectual humility.
It is. It respects God's utter transcendence. Aquinas meticulously argues that God is absolutely simple, meaning he is not composed of parts in any way. Let's break down what that means he denies of God.
Okay.
First, God is not composed of material parts. He's not a physical body, not extended in space, not subject to physical change or division. He's pure spirit.
So completely immaterial.
Completely. Second, he's not composed of form and matter. In Aristotelian thought, physical things are a composite, like a statue is bronze, matter, shaped into a form. God isn't like that. He's pure form, pure actuality, with no underlying stuff that limits him.
No potentiality waiting to be actualized.
Exactly. Third, he's not composed of subject and nature. For us, there's the individual, like Socrates, the subject, who possesses a nature, humanity. But God doesn't have a nature. He is his divine nature. There's no distinction.
He just is what he is.
Right. Fourth, he's not composed of genus and difference. We define things by putting them in a category, genus like animal, and saying what makes them specific within that category, difference like rational. God doesn't fit into any category or genus alongside created things. He's utterly unique, transcending all classifications. He is being itself, not a kind of being.
So beyond all our usual ways of classifying things.
Absolutely. Fifth, and this is crucial, he's not composed of esses, existence, the act of being, and essence, what a thing is. For everything else, what it is, its essence, is distinct from the fact that it is its existence. A unicorn has an essence, we can define it, but it lacks existence. You and I have an essence, humanity, and we also have existence, but they aren't identical.
But for God.
For God, Aquinas argues, his essence is his existence. What he is to be. He doesn't just participate in existence like created things do. He is the sheer act of existing itself. This makes his existence absolutely necessary. He cannot not exist because his very nature is existence.
Wow, that's a huge concept. Essence equals existence.
It's incredibly profound. And finally, he's not composed of substance and accident. We are substances, like a person, a tree, who have accidental properties, like being tall, being green, being happy, that can change without changing what we fundamentally are. God has no accidents. Whatever attributes he has, like goodness, wisdom, power, he has them essentially. God is goodness, his wisdom, his power. They aren't qualities added onto his substance. They are identical with his substance, his simple being.
Okay, that's a lot of negation.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes God's radical difference from creation.
Yeah.
So after all this removing, what positive affirmations can we make about God's nature according to Aquinas? What is God?
Well, these negations actually lead directly to positive affirmations. Because God is not composed, not subject to change or being moved, as the first way showed, he must be pure actuality, actus purus. He has no unfulfilled potential, no passive potency waiting to be actualized by something else. Think of potentiality as kind of imperfection, a lack. God, being perfect, has no potentiality. He is fully actualized, complete being.
Like the ultimate source of all action and reality without needing anything himself.
Precisely. And because form is the principle of acting, and God is the ultimate first agent, the source of all action, who isn't acted upon by anything else, he must be pure form without matter. Matter implies potentiality and limitation. Pure form implies pure actuality.
Pure actuality, pure form. What else?
He also uses that distinction, which has Platonic roots, between being something through one's essence and being something by participation. For instance, created things are good by participation. They receive or reflect goodness, which ultimately comes from God. But God is goodness through his essence. He doesn't receive goodness. He is the fullness of goodness itself.
The source, not just a recipient.
Exactly. And most fundamentally, only God is subsistent being itself. Ipsum esse subsistence. Through his essence. He is the sheer act of existing, subsisting in and through himself. He doesn't have existence as a property bestowed upon him. He is existence. This absolute identity of God with his own active being is the ultimate ground of his divine necessity and his role as the source of all reality. Everything else exists because it receives existence from him.
It's a mind-bending concept, trying to grasp a being whose very nature is existence itself. It certainly explains why Chesterton said, discussing God's simplicity makes you wonder what his complexity must be like. It really prevents us from making God too small, fitting him into our neat little boxes.
That's exactly the point. It preserves God's mystery and transcendence while still allowing reason to say meaningful things about him.
Okay, so moving from the utterly transcendent nature of God back down to us humans, how did Aquinas view humanity, our nature, our ethics, and the role of law within this grand integrated framework he built?
Well, Aquinas' anthropology. His view of human nature sees us as a unique, unified substance. We are composed of both a material body and an immaterial spiritual soul. Now, this might sound dualistic, like Descartes later, but Aquinas worked hard to emphasize the unity.
Not a ghost in a machine.
Right. For Aquinas, the soul is the form of the body. It's what makes the matter of the body a living human thing. They constitute a single substance, a single human being. The soul's essential role is to actualize the body, enabling us to perceive, feel, grow, and interact with the physical world through our senses.
But the soul also has higher functions, right? Like intellect.
Exactly. While united to the body, the human soul possesses an intellect, a power of understanding that can operate in a way independently of the physical organs. This allows us to abstract universal concepts from the particular sensory experiences we have.
So knowledge starts with the senses, but the intellect takes it further. He sounds almost like an empiricist in that way.
There's definitely a strong empirical streak. He famously adopted the Aristotelian principle, nihil est in intellectu quod non prius in sensu. There is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. We don't have innate ideas floating around in our minds from birth, like Plato might have suggested. All our concepts originate from processing sensory data.
So we see lots of individual dogs.
And our intellect abstracts the universal concept of dogness, or canine nature, from those particular experiences. It's this power of abstraction that points to the soul's immaterial nature for Aquinas. He also argued strongly that the human soul is incorruptible, meaning once God creates it, it exists forever. It doesn't die with the body.
Immortality of the soul.
Yes. And from this foundation of a unified body-soul creature with an immortal intellectual soul, Aquinas strongly emphasized human dignity and liberty. Central to this was the concept of free will, liberum arbitrium. He saw the human will as a rational appetite, capable of acting as a self-mover.
Meaning we aren't just pushed around by instincts or external forces.
Right. Unlike animals or inanimate objects whose actions are determined by natural necessity or instinct, human beings, guided by reason, can deliberate and choose between different courses of action. We can choose our own ends, at least to some extent. This capacity for self-determination is what makes us morally responsible agents.
And building on that free will and reason, what's the goal of human life in his ethical framework? What are we striving for?
His ethical system is deeply rooted in Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, but Christianized, obviously. Like Aristotle, he states that all human action aims at some good, and the ultimate end, the highest good for humanity, is happiness, beatitudo.
Happiness. But what kind of happiness? Just feeling good.
Not just fleeting pleasure. For Aquinas, true, ultimate happiness consists in achieving our highest potential as human beings. Given our nature as rational creatures, this involves the perfection of our intellect. Ultimately, for Aquinas, perfect happiness is found only in the supernatural end. The direct vision of God in the afterlife, and intellectual contemplation of the divine essence.
So our earthly life is about moving towards that ultimate end.
Yes. This pursuit involves actualizing our intellectual and moral capacities to the utmost. It's about becoming as good as we can be, perfecting our nature, and by doing so, contributing to the overall goodness and order of the universe that reflects God's plan.
And how do we do that reliably? How do we become good?
Through virtue. To reliably act morally and move towards our true end, we must cultivate virtuous dispositions. Virtues are stable habits, perfections of the soul's powers, intellect and will, that enable us to act well consistently. They are acquired through repeated good actions, guided by reason, and for the theological virtues, aided by grace.
Like the cardinal virtues.
Exactly. He detailed the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, practical wisdom; justice, giving others their due; temperance, moderation of desires; and fortitude, courage in facing difficulties, which perfect our natural abilities. And then the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, love, which are infused by God's grace and direct us specifically towards our supernatural end, union with God. It's not just about knowing what's right, it's about developing the character to do what's right habitually.
Shaping our character through deliberate choices and actions. And then he brings in the concept of law, which seems absolutely central to his ethics and politics. How did he define law?
Law is hugely important for Aquinas. He famously defined law, in general, as an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. Let's break that down. It has to be reasonable, aimed at the good of everyone, made by legitimate authority, and made known publicly.
Okay, that makes sense for human laws. But he had a broader view, didn't he? Different kinds of law.
Oh yes, a whole hierarchy. For him, all true law ultimately originates from the eternal law. This is God's own divine reason, his wise and loving plan by which he governs the entire universe, directing all creatures' actions and movements towards their proper ends. It's the ultimate blueprint for reality.
So the mind of God governing everything, how do we access that?
Well, rational creatures, humans and angels, participate in this eternal law in a special way. We can understand its basic principles through our natural reason. This participation of the rational creature in the eternal law is what Aquinas calls natural law.
Natural law, those basic moral principles we can figure out just by thinking about human nature and the world.
Precisely. It's the inherent moral order imprinted on our hearts, discoverable by reason. Things like do good and avoid evil, preserve life, live in society, seek the truth, worship God. These are universal principles accessible to everyone, regardless of specific religious revelation.
And human laws fit in here somewhere.
Yes. Human law, lex humana, comes next. These are the specific, concrete rules and statutes made by human societies to order community life towards the common good. For a human law to be just and morally binding, Aquinas argues, it must be derived from and be consistent with the natural law. If a human law contradicts the natural law, it's not true law, but a perversion of law, and doesn't bind in conscience.
So there's a moral standard above human legislation.
Absolutely. But he also recognized the need for divine law. This is law given directly by God through revelation, like the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament and the teachings of Christ in the New Testament.
Why do we need divine law if we have natural law?
For several reasons. First, to direct humanity towards its supernatural and eternal happiness with God, which goes beyond what natural reason alone can fully grasp or guide us towards. Second, to provide certainty about what God requires, as human reason can err. Third, because human law can only regulate external actions, while divine law can govern internal acts, thoughts, and desires. And fourth, because human law, aiming at the common good, cannot possibly forbid all vices without being overly burdensome or counterproductive. Divine law can forbid all sin.
So a complex but coherent system, eternal, natural, human, and divine law, all interconnected.
Exactly, all flowing from God's wisdom and aimed at our ultimate good.
Okay, so bringing this all together, what does this mean for us today? What's the enduring legacy of this incredible mind, this angelic doctor, whose thought is still being wrestled with centuries later?
The impact is just immense, truly foundational for Western thought. His Summa Theologia, especially, profoundly shaped Christian theology, particularly within the Catholic tradition, for centuries. It's hard to overstate its influence. His systematic integration of Aristotelian philosophy provided this coherent, intellectually rigorous account of God, creation, human nature, and morality that aligned powerfully with church teaching and existing traditions. It basically became the framework.
Giving theology a powerful philosophical backbone?
Absolutely. And beyond theology, his work had broader implications. G.K. Chesterton pointed out that Aquinas established subordinate sovereignties or autonomies. He defended the legitimate independence of created things like the autonomy of reason, the reliability of the senses, the natural order, while always maintaining God's ultimate sovereignty over everything. This meant that science and philosophy had their own legitimate spheres. They weren't simply swallowed by theology.
That seems quite modern, actually, setting boundaries, respecting different domains of knowledge.
It was quite forward-thinking. Furthermore, some of his specific doctrines had significant social and political implications. His ideas about the just price in economic transactions argued against exploitation and usury. His discussions on government included conditions under which resistance to tyranny might be justifiable, a very complex and debated point, but it showed rulers weren't absolute. And his emphasis on the spiritual equality of all the baptized within the communion of saints helps lay groundwork for limiting arbitrary political power and promoting a more just social vision.
So not just abstract theology, but ideas with real-world consequences. And his influence didn't just fade away, did it? There was a major revival later on.
No, not at all. In the 19th century, there was a huge resurgence of interest known as neo-scholasticism or neo-Thomism. Thinkers realized his framework offered powerful responses to modern philosophical challenges like materialism and skepticism. This culminated institutionally when Pope Leo XIII issued the encyclical Aeterni Patris in 1879.
What did that do?
It officially declared Aquinas' Theology and Philosophy a definitive, authoritative exposition of Catholic doctrine. It strongly urged Catholic clergy, seminaries, and universities worldwide to adopt his teachings as the foundation of their philosophical and theological studies. This cemented his status and ensured his thought remained central to Catholic intellectual life right up to and beyond the Second Vatican Council. His influence continues to be enormous.
So his influence isn't just historical, it's actively reaffirmed and studied. And in modern debates, especially online or in philosophy classes, his arguments for God's existence are still very much alive, aren't they? They haven't just become museum pieces.
Oh, absolutely not. Aquinas' arguments for God's existence, especially the five ways, continue to be actively debated, defended, and critiqued in contemporary philosophy of religion. Go on to forums like Reddit's Rask Philosophy or R Debate Religion, and you'll find threads discussing the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, divine simplicity, all concepts heavily shaped by Aquinas popping up constantly.
People are still finding them relevant for grappling with big questions.
Definitely. His philosophical framework, particularly his sophisticated arguments about causation, contingency, actuality, and potentiality, the very nature of being itself, it remains a major point of reference, both for those seeking intellectually satisfying reasons for belief in God and for those engaging seriously with philosophical objections to theism. His work provides a rich vocabulary and conceptual toolkit for these fundamental discussions.
It's really incredible that a thinker from the 13th century can still be so deeply relevant to how we discuss the most profound questions of existence, reason, and faith today.
It truly speaks to the enduring logical rigor and the sheer philosophical depth of his thought. His detailed explorations of incredibly complex concepts like divine simplicity or the analogy of being or the precise relationship between essence and existence, these continue to be subjects of intense philosophical analysis, interpretation, and defense in academic philosophy and theology. His influence really extends far beyond just Catholic circles, impacting Christian apologetics broadly and even interacting with streams of continental philosophy. That labyrinthine city of his thought, as Chesterton called it, still offers countless pathways for inquiry and understanding, even in our wildly different information-saturated age.
He showed us, perhaps more powerfully than anyone, that faith and reason don't have to be adversaries. They can be allies, even partners, in the great human quest for truth. And that message, well, that feels more relevant than ever.
I couldn't agree more.
We've journeyed through the medieval intellectual landscape, seen how Thomas Aquinas masterfully forged a path, demonstrating how rigorous reason and profound faith could not only coexist, but actually converge, leading towards a deeper understanding of God, humanity, and the cosmos. But here's a thought to leave you with. Even in our hyper-connected, information-overloaded age, are we truly any better at integrating different forms of knowledge, different ways of knowing? Or do we often find ourselves retreating into the perceived comfort of our own intellectual silos? Science here, faith there, philosophy somewhere else, perhaps missing that deeper underlying unity that Aquinas worked so tirelessly to reveal. That unity between what our reason can discover and what our heart, through faith and love, chooses to believe.